Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we take you deep into the heart of the Mafia, revealing the rise and fall of some of the most notorious figures in organized crime. This is the story of John Gotti, Lucky Luciano, and Joe Colombo, three men whose ambition, loyalty, and betrayals would shape the future of the American Mafia. A tale of power, deception, and deadly loyalty. This case will leave you wondering, how far are these men willing to go for power? And what happens when that loyalty is tested? What happens when one man's thirst for the spotlight begins to unravel everything? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and twisted story of three hours inside the Mafia. What happens when loyalty becomes a weapon? In the cutthroat world of the Mafia, alliances are everything, but so is betrayal. Join us as we uncover the shocking rise and deadly fall of Mafia titans like John Gotti, Lucky Luciano, and Joe Colombo, where power, ambition, and a single betrayal turned everything upside down. In the end, no one was untouchable, not even the men who once ruled the streets. Stay with us, because in the world of the Mafia, trust is the most dangerous game of all. John Gotti's rise to power in the underworld of New York City is the stuff of legend. He wasn't born into a world of wealth or privilege, but into the harsh realities of the streets. Raised in a working-class family in the gritty neighborhood of Ozone Park, Queens, Gotti's early life wasn't marked by luxury or opportunity. His parents, both Italian immigrants, struggled to make ends meet, and young John learned early on that survival in his world meant becoming tough, resourceful, and street-smart. From a young age, Gotti was drawn to the world of organized crime. The Mafia wasn't just a distant presence in his neighborhood, it was a way of life. As a teenager, Gotti began associating with older, more powerful figures in the Gambino crime family. By his early 20s, he was involved in petty crimes, robberies, extortions, and racketeering, but he quickly demonstrated his ability to rise above the others. What set him apart wasn't just his ambition, but his ruthless efficiency. He had an uncanny ability to avoid detection by law enforcement, and this soon earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. As Gotti made a name for himself within the Gambino family, the organization itself was undergoing a transformation. The family was one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York, but by the time Gotti was becoming a key player, the family was struggling under the leadership of Paul Castellano. Castellano, a man who was known for his cold, calculated leadership, had turned the Gambino family into an even more profitable empire, but at the expense of alienating many of its members. The tension within the family was palpable. Castellano, though wealthy, was seen by many of the family's old guard as an outsider. His association with high society and his preference for a more businesslike approach to crime had created a rift between him and the more traditional Mafia soldiers, who valued loyalty and toughness over corporate strategies. It was during this time that Gotti began to rise within the ranks. His reputation as a fierce and loyal enforcer spread, and he attracted the attention of the top figures in the Gambino family. But Gotti wasn't just another mobster looking for a seat at the table. He had a vision, and he had the ambition to turn that vision into reality. He was no longer content to just be a soldier in the family, he wanted to be the boss. The opportunity for Gotti to seize control of the Gambino family came in 1985, when Castellano was gunned down in a shocking ambush. The hit was orchestrated by Gotti himself, with the full backing of his closest allies in the family. The murder was not just an act of power, it was a declaration of Gotti's dominance. In the violent world of the Mafia, it was the ultimate move to eliminate a rival and solidify one's own place at the top. The cold-blooded nature of the murder sent a clear message: John Gotti would stop at nothing to take control. After Castellano's death, Gotti was quickly made the new boss of the Gambino family. The streets of New York now belonged to him. But Gotti's reign was not just built on violence and bloodshed, was also a masterclass in media manipulation. Gotti understood the power of public perception, and he used the press to his advantage. He became a media sensation, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his sharp suits and charismatic public persona. The media painted him as a mobster who could charm his way out of any situation, and Gotti reveled in it. He played the role of the charming, affable gangster to perfection, turning the public's fascination with him into a shield. His ability to manipulate the press made him a folk hero of sorts to some, while others saw him as a dangerous, calculating criminal. Despite his public image, Gotti's grip on the Gambino family was anything but secure. While Gotti was enjoying the perks of his new position, other members of the Mafia were watching closely. Power struggles and betrayals were an inevitable part of the underworld, and Gotti's reign was no different. His ability to avoid conviction in a series of high-profile trials only solidified his status as one of the most powerful men in the Mafia, but it also made him a target. The most infamous of Gotti's legal battles came in 1992, when he was charged with a variety of crimes, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, yet Gotti remained calm and collected. As always, he managed to avoid a conviction, and the charges were eventually dropped. But even though Gotti had managed to escape conviction, the toll it took on his family and the Gambino organization was immense. Gotti's continued success in evading justice earned him a reputation as one of the most elusive and dangerous criminals in the world. His name became synonymous with the Mafia, and his power was unmatched. But the tides were beginning to turn. While Gotti had managed to outmaneuver the law, he could not escape the growing tensions within his own ranks. The Gambino family was crumbling from within. The same ambition and ruthless drive that had helped Gotti rise to the top were now working against him. Gotti's leadership style, while effective, had alienated many of his allies. As Gotti became more powerful, his enemies within the Mafia grew bolder. The story of his downfall would be just as dramatic as his rise to power. Gotti's reign eventually ended in the mid-1990s, but not because of law enforcement. The Gambino family turned on him. One by one, his closest allies began to betray him, providing evidence that would eventually lead to his conviction. Gotti's own brother-in-law, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, was one of the key figures who turned on him, testifying against Gotti and ensuring his downfall. Gravano's testimony was damning, and it was the final blow to Gotti's empire. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on charges of murder, racketeering, and other crimes and sentenced to life in prison. The once untouchable mob boss was now behind bars, his power shattered. But even in prison, Gotti's name continued to carry weight in the world of organized crime. His story became the stuff of legend, a man who had risen from the streets to become one of the most powerful mobsters in history, only to be brought down by betrayal and his own hubris. John Gotti's rise and fall serves as a chilling reminder of the ruthless nature of organized crime and the price of ambition. His legacy is one of power, betrayal, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of being at the top of the Mafia world. Charles "Lucky" Luciano's story is one of ambition, transformation, and the reshaping of an entire criminal underworld. Born in Sicily in 1897, Luciano emigrated to the United States with his parents at the age of 9, settling in the bustling Lower East Side of Manhattan. The family lived in poverty, struggling to make ends meet, and young Charles quickly realized that the world around him was filled with harsh realities. His early life was shaped by the rough streets of New York, where survival often meant embracing the same ruthlessness that governed the city's criminal world. By his early teens, Luciano had dropped out of school and was already running with a gang of local troublemakers, committing petty thefts and getting into street brawls. But Luciano was no ordinary street kid. He was shrewd, calculating, and had an eye for opportunity. Unlike many of his peers, Luciano didn't want to just survive on the streets, he wanted to dominate them. He understood that in order to rise, he would have to break free from the petty criminal world that so many before him had occupied. And so, Luciano began to set his sights higher, looking beyond the small-time hustlers to the larger criminal organizations that controlled the city's rackets. At just 14 years old, he was already working with a notorious gangster named Arnold Rothstein, who was one of the most influential figures in New York's organized crime world. Rothstein, who had made his fortune fixing the 1919 World Series, was a key player in the syndicates that ran gambling, bootlegging, and various illegal activities throughout the city. Under Rothstein's mentorship, Luciano began to learn the finer points of organized crime, how to control territory, how to build alliances, and most importantly, how to make money in a world that ran on corruption and violence. Luciano's involvement in the criminal world wasn't just about petty crime, it was about creating something bigger, more structured, and far more profitable. He understood that the fragmented nature of New York's mafia families was a weakness that could be exploited. The families were constantly at war with one another, fighting for control over territories and rackets, but Luciano saw the potential for unity. He realized that if the families could put aside their differences and work together, they could create a far more powerful and profitable criminal empire. This vision of a unified mafia would become the cornerstone of Luciano's success. By the early 1930s, Luciano's power and influence had grown significantly. He was involved in everything from bootlegging to gambling, narcotics trafficking to labor racketeering. He had also become a trusted associate of some of the most powerful figures in the city's criminal world, including Meyer Lansky, a fellow Jewish gangster, and Bugsy Siegel, who would later go on to have a key role in the creation of Las Vegas. Luciano was part of a new breed of mobster, one who was not only ruthless but also business savvy. He wasn't just about violence, he was about making money, expanding influence, and, most importantly, creating a legacy. However, as Luciano's empire grew, so did the number of enemies who sought to challenge his power. In the 1930s, the mafia in New York was still largely fragmented, with the five families Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo constantly vying for control of the city's criminal activities. The old guard, including powerful figures like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, were reluctant to change. They believed in the traditional ways of doing business, relying on violence and intimidation to maintain their power. But Luciano had a different vision. He saw the future of organized crime as a more structured, corporate-like operation, where different factions worked together, shared profits, and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Luciano's vision was put to the test in a violent showdown between Masseria and Maranzano. Both men controlled vast portions of New York's mafia world, and they had no intention of sharing power. Masseria, who was the head of the Genovese family, was old-fashioned in his approach, relying on brute force to maintain control. Maranzano, on the other hand, was a more calculating figure who sought to consolidate power through strategic alliances. Luciano, who had been working with both men, saw that the infighting was weakening the mafia and that it was time to take decisive action. In 1931, Luciano took matters into his own hands. He ordered the murder of Joe Masseria, a move that shocked the mafia world. With Masseria out of the picture, Luciano quickly moved to eliminate his other rival, Salvatore Maranzano. In a swift and brutal move, Luciano had Maranzano killed, consolidating power over the mafia in New York. But Luciano didn't just want to be another mob boss, he wanted to reshape the very structure of the mafia. To do this, Luciano created the Commission, an unprecedented governing body that would oversee the operations of all the five families. The Commission would act as a sort of mafia congress, where leaders from each of the families could meet to resolve disputes, divide profits, and ensure the stability of the organized crime world. The creation of the Commission was a revolutionary move that effectively ended the constant infighting that had plagued the mafia for years. For the first time, there was a sense of order, a sense that the mafia was now a unified force that could rival any legitimate business empire. Luciano's power continued to grow as he expanded his influence across the country. He became involved in a variety of illegal operations, from narcotics trafficking to the control of the waterfront. He used his position as the head of the Commission to broker deals between different factions, ensuring that everyone got a cut of the action. But Luciano's ambitions didn't stop at New York. He had his sights set on expanding the mafia's reach across the entire United States, and he saw that the key to success was forging strong relationships with other criminal organizations. He cultivated alliances with Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Siegel, as well as with Italian crime families across the country. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's reach extended to Chicago, Florida, and even into the world of Hollywood. Despite his growing empire, Luciano's downfall was inevitable. In 1936, he was arrested and convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution, a case that sent shockwaves through the criminal world. The conviction was a result of a prolonged investigation led by Thomas Dewey, a young and ambitious district attorney who would later become the governor of New York. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, but even behind bars, his influence didn't wane. He continued to run his criminal empire through intermediaries, ensuring that the mafia remained a powerful force in America's underworld. Luciano's time in prison would not last forever, however. In 1946, after serving just a decade of his sentence, he was deported to Italy, where he continued to wield influence over mafia operations in Europe and beyond. His life and legacy had become mythologized, with his role in shaping the modern mafia cemented as one of the most significant in organized crime history. Charles Lucky Luciano's vision transformed the mafia from a fragmented, violent world into a powerful, cohesive organization. His creation of the Commission not only changed the structure of organized crime, but also made it a force to be reckoned with across the world. Despite his eventual arrest and deportation, Luciano's impact on the criminal underworld would echo for decades. His name became synonymous with power, innovation, and the ruthlessness necessary to dominate a world built on fear. Joe Colombo was not the typical mafia boss. In an era dominated by violence, betrayal, and brutal power struggles, Colombo stood out as a man with a different vision. Born in 1923 in New York City to Italian immigrants, Colombo grew up in the heart of the Italian-American community. Unlike many of his peers, who were drawn to the criminal lifestyle through necessity or circumstance, Colombo was raised with a strong sense of pride in his heritage. His path to becoming a mobster, however, was inevitable. Like many others from his neighborhood, he became involved in petty crime at a young age, eventually rising through the ranks of the Colombo crime family, which was one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York. Colombo's ambition, however, wasn't just about gaining power within the mafia. He had aspirations that went beyond the traditional scope of organized crime. He believed that the mafia should be seen in a more positive light, one that didn't just focus on criminal activities, but also contributed to the community. Colombo was unique among mafia leaders because he understood the importance of public perception and sought to reshape the image of Italian Americans in the eyes of the public. It was this drive that would later lead him to become a controversial figure, both within the mafia and in the broader Italian-American community. By the late 1960s, Colombo had firmly established himself as a powerful figure in the Colombo family. His rise to the top was marked by a series of violent confrontations with rival factions, but Colombo's leadership was not solely based on intimidation. He had a knack for diplomacy and negotiation, and his ability to broker deals between rival families earned him respect in the world of organized crime. However, his growing power and influence did not sit well with everyone, and not all of his fellow mobsters shared his vision of a more respectable mafia. Despite his growing prominence within the family, Colombo was keenly aware of the power struggles that took place within the mafia world. The 5 families had been at war with each other for decades, constantly fighting for dominance over territory and criminal enterprises. By the 1970s, the Colombo family itself was embroiled in a bloody war for control. Colombo, despite his leadership, was faced with the challenge of managing this internal strife, while also dealing with external pressures from law enforcement, the media, and even the government. At the same time, Colombo's public persona was growing. In 1975, he founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization aimed at promoting the rights and dignity of Italian Americans, who were often unfairly portrayed in the media as violent criminals. Colombo's push to legitimize the mafia was a bold move, one that set him apart from his more traditionalist counterparts. While many mafia leaders were content to stay in the shadows, Colombo took a more public stance, leading rallies and organizing events to raise awareness about the challenges facing Italian Americans. His efforts were not without controversy. Many in the mafia saw his activism as a threat to the secrecy and control they had worked so hard to maintain. They were concerned that Colombo's public visibility would attract too much attention and bring unwanted heat from the authorities. Colombo's efforts to reshape the mafia's image were not well received by all. His push for legitimacy and visibility alienated powerful figures in the mafia, including those in his own family. The tension between Colombo and his rivals within the Colombo family escalated, and it was clear that his vision for the future of organized crime was not shared by everyone. In 1971, just a few years before Colombo launched the Civil Rights League, the family's internal conflicts reached a breaking point. A faction within the Colombo family, led by fellow mobster Carmine the Beast Persico, began plotting against him. The resulting power struggle became one of the most violent in the history of the Mafia. Colombo, however, continued to press forward with his public campaigns, believing that he could balance both the underworld and the outside world. The tension between Colombo and his enemies in the Mafia culminated in a brutal assassination attempt in 1971. Colombo had been making public appearances and speeches, using his position as the head of the Italian-American Civil Rights League to garner support from the public and politicians alike. On June 28, 1971, during one such rally at the Columbus Circle in New York City, Colombo was shot in the head. The assassination attempt left him gravely wounded but miraculously alive. Colombo was rushed to the hospital, where he would remain in a coma for several years, paralyzed and unable to communicate. The hit on Colombo was a direct message from his enemies in the Mafia. His efforts to reshape the image of the Mafia and push for legitimacy had made him a liability. Despite being incapacitated, Colombo's family did not immediately fall apart. His son, also named Joseph Colombo, took over the leadership of the family, but the power struggles within the organization continued. Carmine Persico, Colombo's rival, quickly seized control of the family, effectively becoming the boss while Colombo remained in a coma. The assassination attempt was a watershed moment in the history of the Colombo family, marking the beginning of a period of instability and bloodshed. However, the family's fortunes did not entirely rest on Colombo's shoulders. Despite the power vacuum, his family continued to operate under the control of his son and the remaining loyalists who believed in his vision. While Colombo remained out of the public eye, his influence was still felt throughout the Mafia. His attempted assassination had sparked waves of violence and retribution within the family, but Colombo's legacy was far from over. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, though weakened by his incapacitation, continued its work in his name. Colombo's push for justice and dignity for Italian Americans had gained traction, and his efforts would leave a lasting impact on the way Italian Americans were perceived in the public eye. In the years that followed, Colombo's influence continued to reverberate, even as his physical presence in the Mafia world diminished. His vision of a more public and legitimate Mafia had changed the course of history for organized crime. His willingness to challenge the status quo and confront the law in such a bold manner was a testament to his belief in his cause. Even though he was unable to fulfill his dreams, Joe Colombo's fight for the rights of Italian Americans and his attempts to steer the Mafia into a new direction left an indelible mark on both the criminal world and the broader American landscape. By the time Colombo passed away in 1978, he had left behind a divided legacy. His death marked the end of a chapter in Mafia history, but his influence continued to shape the future of organized crime. Though he didn't live to see his vision fully realized, Colombo's efforts to create a more visible and legitimate Mafia changed the course of history. His leadership in the face of adversity, his desire to reform the Mafia's image, and his belief in a better future for Italian Americans ensured that his name would be remembered, not just for the crimes he committed, but for the vision he tried to bring to life. The story of the Mafia is often told through the lens of its most infamous figures, but few stories are as intertwined with the destiny of the American underworld as that of Sammy the Bull Gravano. A key player in the rise and fall of John Gotti and the Gambino crime family, Gravano's life was marked by ambition, violence, and ultimately betrayal. Born in Brooklyn in 1945, Gravano was the son of Italian immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. While his parents worked hard to provide for the family, Gravano grew up in a neighborhood that was steeped in criminal activity. It didn't take long for him to become involved in the local gangs, and by the time he was in his teens, he was already engaged in small-time crimes like burglary and extortion. Gravano's early years were filled with the typical struggles of any young man trying to make his way in a rough neighborhood. However, it was the criminal world that ultimately shaped his path. He quickly made a name for himself, not just for his ruthless behavior, but for his intelligence and understanding of how the Mafia worked. Gravano was a natural. He understood that survival in the underworld required more than just physical strength. It required cunning, manipulation, and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. His rise through the ranks of the Gambino family was swift, and by the 1980s, Gravano had become one of the most trusted and feared members of the organization. What set Gravano apart from many of his peers was his ability to move through the world of organized crime without attracting too much attention. He was discreet, calculating, and avoided the flashness that often marked other Mafia figures. In a world where arrogance and excess often led to downfall, Gravano's restraint and low profile were assets. He was known for his cold, methodical approach to violence, something that earned him respect within the family, but also made him a dangerous figure to cross. Over the years, Gravano's loyalty to the Gambino family, and particularly to John Gotti, helped propel him into a position of power. Gotti's rise to the top of the Gambino family had been a violent one, marked by his orchestrating the murder of Paul Castellano, the previous boss, in 1985. Gotti's victory made him the new boss of the family, and Gravano quickly became his right-hand man. The two shared a close and mutually beneficial relationship, with Gravano handling many of the family's more sensitive operations. Gotti's public persona as the Dapper Don was complemented by Gravano's behind-the-scenes role as the enforcer, the one who made sure the Mafia's business was carried out without a hitch. However, as Gotti's power grew, so did the tension within the Gambino family. The Mafia is a world built on trust, but loyalty is often fleeting, and ambition can quickly turn friends into enemies. While Gotti and Gravano's alliance had once seemed unbreakable, the cracks in their relationship began to appear as Gotti's leadership style became increasingly erratic. Gotti had a flair for the dramatic, using the media to cultivate an image of a charming, untouchable mob boss. He loved the attention, and he reveled in the power that came with his public persona. But while Gotti basked in the spotlight, Gravano preferred to stay out of the limelight, focusing on the inner workings of the family's operations. This difference in temperament created a growing divide between the two men, with Gravano feeling sidelined by Gotti's penchant for theatricality and the media's obsession with him. As the 1990s approached, tensions within the Gambino family reached a boiling point. The family was under increasing pressure from law enforcement, particularly after Gotti managed to evade conviction in a series of high-profile trials. Gotti's ability to avoid conviction had earned him the nickname the Teflon Don, but it also made him a target. The Mafia's enemies were growing bolder, and the family's resources were being stretched thin. Gravano, who had always prided himself on his ability to make the family money without attracting unnecessary attention, began to grow frustrated with Gotti's leadership. While Gotti focused on his public image, Gravano quietly worked behind the scenes, organizing operations and taking care of the family's business. But even Gravano couldn't ignore the mounting pressure and the growing tensions within the Mafia. He knew that Gotti's reckless behavior was putting the family at risk, and the situation was becoming untenable. The breaking point came in 1991. Gravano, fed up with Gotti's increasingly erratic behavior, made the fateful decision to turn against him. For years, Gravano had been loyal to Gotti, even participating in some of the most notorious hits carried out by the Gambino family. But now, Gravano saw that the cost of loyalty was too high. Gotti had become a liability, and Gravano knew that his own survival depended on getting out from under Gotti's shadow. The decision was not an easy one. In the Mafia, betrayal is the ultimate sin, and Gravano knew that he would be risking his life by turning on his boss. But in the end, Gravano's survival instincts won out. He turned state's witness, agreeing to testify against Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gravano's decision to cooperate with the government was a bombshell that reverberated throughout the Mafia world. The testimony he provided was devastating, exposing the inner workings of the Gambino family and implicating some of its most powerful members in a range of criminal activities, including murder, racketeering, and drug trafficking. Gravano's testimony was the key to Gotti's conviction in 1992, and Gotti was sentenced to life in prison. But while Gravano's testimony helped bring down Gotti, it also marked the beginning of his own downfall. In exchange for his cooperation, Gravano received a reduced sentence and was placed in witness protection. However, his decision to turn on Gotti and the Gambino family earned him the ire of many of his former associates, and his life was forever changed. Gravano's betrayal of Gotti was a turning point not just for him, but for the entire Mafia. It exposed the fragility of loyalty in the criminal underworld and highlighted the dangers of becoming too powerful. While Gotti's reign had been marked by his ability to manipulate the media and evade justice, Gravano's cooperation with the government showed that even the most powerful mafia figures could be brought down by the testimony of a trusted insider. Gravano's decision to testify against Gotti forever altered the landscape of organized crime, signaling the beginning of the end for the once dominant Gambino family. After his time in witness protection, Gravano tried to live a quiet life, but the lure of the underworld proved too strong. He eventually left witness protection and returned to the criminal life. His decision to go back to the world he had once betrayed led to further legal troubles, and in the 2000s, he was convicted on charges related to a series of murders and his role in the Gambino family's criminal enterprises. Gravano's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of betrayal, the fragility of loyalty, and the high price of ambition. His role in the downfall of John Gotti marked the end of an era for the Gambino family, and his decision to testify against his former boss will forever be seen as one of the most significant events in the history of organized crime. The final chapter of the Mafia's story was not written in the halls of power or in the boardrooms of criminal empires. It was written in the slow, gradual unraveling of the once mighty Mafia, a decline that reached its peak with the downfall of the Gambino family and the erosion of the Mafia's power in America. The story of the Mafia in the late 20th century is one of attrition, a battle between law enforcement, the changing times, and the violent world of organized crime that had once ruled the streets of New York City and beyond. The Mafia, particularly the five families of New York, had been a force to be reckoned with for nearly a century. From the days of Prohibition, when the Mafia first gained its foothold in the criminal world, to the mid-20th century, when they dominated industries and labor unions, the Mafia was a cornerstone of the American underworld. But by the 1990s, the empire that had once been untouchable began to show cracks. The public perception of the Mafia had begun to change, largely because of increased law enforcement efforts, more public exposure, and the growing sense that organized crime was no longer as invincible as it once seemed. As the world changed, so did the Mafia's ability to adapt. One of the most significant blows to the Mafia came from within. As the 1980s ended and the 1990s began, many of the Mafia's most powerful figures found themselves in increasingly difficult positions. John Gotti, the so-called Dapper Don of the Gambino family, was perhaps the most emblematic of this decline. Gotti's brazen personality and media-savvy tactics had once made him an icon of the criminal world. His ability to escape conviction in several high-profile trials, especially in the 1980s, made him a figure of admiration among his peers. He was seen as untouchable, a symbol of the Mafia's power and resilience, but this very public image of invincibility eventually led to his downfall. Gotti's love for the spotlight, his arrogance, and his disregard for the Mafia's traditional ways of operating created enemies within his own ranks. His obsession with maintaining the Teflon Don persona alienated key figures in the Gambino family, and as his leadership became more erratic, it sowed the seeds for his eventual betrayal. In 1992, the Mafia received its most devastating blow when Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss and trusted ally, turned state's witness and testified against him. Gravano's decision to cooperate with the authorities marked a watershed moment in the history of the Mafia. Gravano's testimony was crucial in securing Gotti's conviction and sending him to prison for life. But beyond the personal betrayal between Gotti and Gravano, this act had far-reaching consequences for the Mafia as a whole. Gravano's decision to turn against Gotti shattered the illusion of loyalty and invincibility that the Mafia had built over decades. It sent a powerful message to both the law enforcement community and the general public. Even the most trusted members of the Mafia could be turned, and no one was safe from the long arm of the law. This betrayal, however, was only one part of the broader picture. Throughout the 1990s, law enforcement agencies, particularly the FBI, had developed more sophisticated methods of tracking and infiltrating organized crime. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants once seen as useless tools in the fight against the Mafia became the keys to bringing down the five families. The government had learned from its past mistakes and was no longer content to wait for the Mafia to make the first move. Instead, they were proactively dismantling the organization from within. The racketeering and corruption that had once allowed the Mafia to thrive were slowly being chipped away. With the RICO Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act passed in the 1970s, law enforcement had gained a powerful weapon in their fight against organized crime. The RICO Act allowed the government to prosecute not just individual criminals, but entire criminal enterprises. This was a game changer for the FBI and other agencies, as it meant that the Mafia could no longer rely on the traditional divide-and-conquer tactics that had kept them untouchable for so long. Law enforcement could now target the entire organization, not just individual members. In the case of Gotti, Gravano, and the Gambino family, the law enforcement strategy paid off. As more Mafia figures were arrested, convicted, and sent to prison, the once powerful families began to lose their grip on the streets. As the 1990s wore on, the Mafia's grip on power weakened even further. The rise of other criminal enterprises, such as drug cartels and street gangs, shifted the criminal landscape in America. These newer groups, often more ruthless and less beholden to traditional codes of honor, were willing to engage in the kinds of violent and destructive behavior that the Mafia had once avoided. The Mafia, on the other hand, was built on a different ethos, a code of silence, respect, and hierarchy that was becoming increasingly out of touch with the brutal, chaotic world of modern crime. In the eyes of younger generations of criminals, the Mafia was no longer the dominant force it had once been. The idea of working in the shadows, as the Mafia had done for decades, seemed antiquated and ineffective when compared to the more violent and chaotic methods of newer criminal organizations. By the end of the 1990s, the Mafia had gone from being an omnipresent force in American society to a shadow of its former self. The most powerful families, the Gambinos, the Lucianos, and the Genoveses, had all suffered serious losses, both in terms of leadership and territory. The Colombo family, which had once been led by the ambitious Joe Colombo, was also in disarray, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressure. The Italian-American community, once seen as synonymous with the Mafia, was no longer as tightly bound to organized crime. And the once great Mafia families, once at the center of the American criminal underworld, had become fragmented and vulnerable. The decline of the Mafia was further hastened by a series of societal and technological changes. The internet, digital communications, and the rise of cybercrime created new avenues for illegal activity, further pushing traditional forms of organized crime to the margins. Law enforcement had adapted to these new challenges, and the Mafia's reliance on old-school tactics became increasingly ineffective. As the 2000s dawned, the Mafia's influence continued to wane. While it still existed in some form, it was no longer the powerful, feared organization that it had once been. The Mafia's golden age had come to an end, and its members were now scattered, facing long prison sentences, death, or a life in hiding. The world had changed, and with it the very nature of crime. The once dominant families were now struggling to survive in a new era, one that they had failed to adapt to. The story of the Mafia's decline is not just one of criminal enterprises falling apart. It is also a story of a world changing around those who once thought they could control it. The rise of law enforcement, the changing nature of crime, and the betrayals that defined the lives of men like Gotti and Gravano all played a part in the Mafia's downfall. By the time the dust had settled, the Mafia that had once ruled the streets of New York was no longer the power it had once been. The end of the Mafia wasn't marked by a single event or a violent clash, but by a slow, inevitable decline, a loss of power that had been years in the making. And with its fall, a new era of crime emerged, one in which the Mafia would no longer be the central player. Thank you for joining us on Mystery Minds today. We hope this chilling journey through the Mafia's most dangerous alliances and betrayals left you with more questions than answers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of organized crime, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories from the world of true crime. Remember, the line between loyalty and betrayal is often thin and the consequences are deadly. Until next time, stay safe and always stay curious.